This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. What we really mean when we say midlife crisis. I want to start by saying something that might feel unsettling, maybe even a little shocking. A midlife crisis doesn't arrive when your life is falling apart. It arrives when your life is working. It shows up when everything looks stable enough that no one would ever think to ask if you're okay. When you have a job you can do on autopilot, relationships that look solid from the outside, a routine that proves you're responsible, capable, reliable. It shows up when you are praised for holding everything together while something inside you has already begun to loosen. A midlife crisis isn't loud. It doesn't kick the door down. It doesn't announce itself. It waits until you're alone. It waits for an ordinary moment standing in your kitchen, driving a familiar road, folding clothes you folded 1,000 times before. And then it asks a question so quietly, you almost miss it. Is this really my life? Not, is this a bad life? Not, am I unhappy enough to justify change? But something far more disturbing. Is this the life I chose? Or the life I learned how to survive? That's what we really mean when we talk about a midlife crisis. It's not a breakdown. It's a recognition. For years, sometimes decades, you've been moving forward by fulfilling roles. You became good at what was needed of you. You learned how to be dependable. You learned how to be strong without making anyone uncomfortable. You learned how to keep going even when you weren't sure what you were going toward. And it worked until it didn't. The crisis begins when success stops feeling like proof of meaning. When checking all the boxes no longer quiets the voice inside you that's asking harder questions. Questions you didn't have time for when you were busy building, raising, managing, stabilizing. Midlife is when identity stops being theoretical. It becomes personal, urgent, heavy, because time changes at this point in life. It's no longer something you spend casually. It's something you feel in your body, in your patience, in the way certain dreams suddenly feel too heavy to keep carrying without examining them. A midlife crisis is not about wanting more. It's about realizing how much of yourself you've been giving away without ever being asked if you wanted to. And here's the part we rarely say out loud. Many women don't experience a midlife crisis because they are unhappy. They experience it because they are exhausted from being enough. Enough for their families. Enough for their work. Enough for their partners. Enough to be admired, trusted, leaned on. But not enough space has been left for them. Somewhere along the way, being needed became more important than being known. Being reliable replaced being alive. And the more competent you became, the harder it was for anyone to imagine that something might be missing, including you. A midlife crisis strips away the illusion that you can postpone yourself forever. It forces you to look at the cost of constant accommodation. The cost of always saying yes because saying no felt selfish. The cost of staying emotionally available while quietly disappearing from your own life. This isn't about regret in the dramatic sense. It's not about wishing you'd made wildly different choices. It's subtler than that. It's the realization that you've been living efficiently but not intimately. That your days are full but not inhabited. And when that realization lands, it can feel terrifying. Not because everything is wrong, but because everything is suddenly up for review. That's why a midlife crisis feels disorienting. It destabilizes the identity you've been rewarded for. The version of you that kept things running smoothly. The version that didn't ask for too much. The version that made life easier for everyone else. When that version starts to crack, the question isn't, what's wrong with me? The real question is, who am I if I stop performing stability? This moment can feel lonely because it's deeply internal. There may be no obvious external trigger, no disaster, no loss others can point to and say, of course she's struggling, which makes it even harder to explain. How do you say, nothing is wrong, but something is missing? How do you admit that you're not broken, but you're not whole either? If you're listening to this and feeling that quiet ache of recognition, I want you to pause for a moment, not to fix it, not to label it, but to notice it. Because what you're experiencing is not failure, it's awareness. And awareness is always disruptive before it becomes clarifying. Before we go any further, before we talk about desire, boundaries, disappointment, and the invisible emotional labor of midlife, if this resonates, if you feel seen in this quiet, unsettling place, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, not because I'm here to motivate you or give you answers, but because I want to keep making space for conversations that most women are having alone. Your support makes it possible for this channel to continue telling the truth softly, honestly, and without rushing to conclusions. A midlife crisis is not the end of something. It's the moment the old story stops being sufficient. And what comes next is not as loud as we've been led to believe. When time starts talking back, there is a moment in midlife when time stops being background noise. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with panic or drama. It simply changes texture. What used to feel wide and forgiving becomes precise, measured, almost intimate. Time begins to touch everything. When I was younger, time was something I spent without thinking. I assumed there would always be more of it later. More chances, more versions of myself, more opportunities to return to things I postponed. Time moved forward, but it stayed silent. It didn't ask anything of me. Then, quietly, it started talking back. Not in words, never in words. It spoke through sensations, through moments that felt heavier than they should have, through pauses that lingered a little too long, through the strange feeling of being early and late at the same time. I began to notice how often I was counting without meaning to. Not days or years, but thresholds. Before this gets harder, before that door closes, before my energy shifts again, before I become someone else without choosing to. Time, at midlife, becomes personal. It shows up in small, almost embarrassing ways. Catching your reflection when you're not prepared for it. Realizing your body remembers things your mind tries to ignore. Hearing yourself say, I don't have the patience for that anymore. And understanding that it's not impatience, it's discernment. The unsettling part isn't aging itself. It's the awareness that time is no longer abstract. It's no longer an idea you can outrun with busyness. It's something that presses gently but persistently against your decisions. Every yes now has weight. Every later has consequences. Every habit asks to be justified. Midlife is when time stops tolerating unconscious living. I didn't suddenly become afraid of death. That's a misunderstanding many people have about this phase of life. What unsettled me was something far quieter. The realization that I might never get around to myself if I kept living the way I always had. Time wasn't threatening me with an ending. It was confronting me with a pattern. I could see the repetition clearly now, the same weeks folding into each other, the same priorities reshuffling themselves without ever changing, the same version of me waking up, performing competence, and going to sleep slightly disconnected from my own interior life. And time kept asking, not loudly, not cruelly, is this how you want to spend what remains? That question isn't dramatic. It doesn't demand immediate action. That's what makes it so unsettling. It lingers. It follows you into mundane moments. It sits beside you while you're driving, cooking, answering emails, living a life that looks fine. This is when many women begin to feel unmoored without knowing why. There's no crisis others can point to, no single event that explains the shift. Just a growing sense that the future is no longer infinite and that truth deserves attention. Time also changes the way we remember. In midlife, the past stops being something you casually reference and starts being something you inventory. You remember the paths you didn't take, not with regret exactly, but with curiosity that comes too late to be playful. You think about the selves you imagined becoming, and you realize some of them were never meant to survive your circumstances. And then there's grief in that realization. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief, the kind that doesn't ask to be fixed, only acknowledged. Time gives that grief a voice. It also strips away illusions. The illusion that you'll feel ready later. The illusion that clarity comes before action. The illusion that meaning arrives fully formed if you just keep waiting. What time reveals in midlife is not scarcity, but specificity. You begin to understand that your energy is not endless. Your attention is not replaceable. Your presence is not something you can offer everywhere without disappearing somewhere else. This is where the anxiety creeps in, not because you're panicking, but because you're finally paying attention. Time asks better questions than urgency ever did. It asks what you want to carry forward. It asks what no longer belongs to you. It asks which parts of your life are alive and which are merely familiar. And perhaps the most difficult question of all, who are you becoming by default? Midlife doesn't force answers. It simply removes the luxury of indifference. There is something profoundly destabilizing about realizing that the second half of your life is no longer theoretical. It is happening now, whether you're engaged with it or not. And that awareness can feel like standing at the edge of something you can't name yet. That edge is not danger, it's responsibility. Not responsibility to others, you've carried that for years. Responsibility to your own becoming. Time, at this stage, is not an enemy, but it is uncompromising. It won't be distracted by productivity. It won't be soothed by reassurance. It won't be impressed by how well you're functioning. It wants honesty, and honesty, when it arrives before you're ready, can feel like a crisis. But what time is really doing what it has been patiently doing all along is inviting you into a more conscious relationship with your life. Not louder, not bigger, just more intentional. The discomfort you feel when time starts talking back isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something matters. And once time has your attention, it doesn't let go easily. It keeps whispering through choices, through fatigue, through longing, through the growing sense that whatever comes next cannot be lived on autopilot. That whisper isn't asking you to hurry. It's asking you to listen. Desire without edges. When love begins to consume. I used to believe that love, if it was real, would eventually settle. That desire would soften with familiarity, that wanting would become gentler once two people felt secure. I thought love aged into something quieter and less demanding. What I didn't understand then was that desire doesn't naturally grow edges. It expands. Desire wants closeness, but closeness is never enough. It wants access, but access quickly turns into expectation. It wants intimacy, but intimacy, when it isn't bounded, begins to reach into places that were never meant to be shared entirely. This isn't a moral failing. It's a human pattern. I didn't notice it at first because it felt flattering. Being wanted always does. There's a particular warmth that comes from knowing someone wants your time, your attention, your emotional presence. It feels like proof that you matter, that you're significant, that your absence would be felt. So I gave. I gave time that used to belong to my quiet. I gave attention that once wandered freely. I gave emotional availability without asking what it was replacing. And because desire doesn't announce itself as consumption, I mistook the gradual narrowing of my life for commitment. Wanting, I learned later, is effortless. It costs nothing to want more of someone. But giving is never neutral. Giving rearranges a life. It redistributes energy. It slowly redraws the borders of who you are. In midlife, that asymmetry becomes impossible to ignore. I began to sense that love, at least the way I had learned to practice it, didn't know when to stop asking. Not because it was cruel, but because desire has no internal governor. It doesn't self-regulate. It doesn't pause to ask if the person being loved is still intact. Desire wants the version of you that was available yesterday, even if today that version costs you something you can no longer afford. That realization is uncomfortable, especially for women who have been socialized to equate love with generosity, to believe that if something feels draining, it must mean we're doing it wrong, that if we're tired, we should simply love better. But midlife reveals something different. Exhaustion isn't always a sign of failure. Sometimes it's a sign of overexposure. Love without edges doesn't break you all at once. It erodes you slowly. It replaces solitude with obligation. It turns presence into performance. It makes you feel essential while quietly making you interchangeable with your own labor. I wasn't being mistreated. That's the part that made this so hard to see. There was no villain, no dramatic conflict, no obvious harm, just a subtle expectation that I would continue to be available in the same ways, even as my internal landscape was changing. Desire rarely adapts on its own. It assumes continuity. It assumes that what was given once can be given again. It assumes that access, once granted, is permanent. Midlife is when that assumption collapses. Not because love has failed, but because the self that was giving without question has evolved. My capacity shifted. My tolerance for constant emotional openness narrowed. I no longer wanted to be consumed, even gently. What surprised me most was how difficult it felt to name this. There is very little language for saying, I still care, but I cannot be endlessly available. Especially as a woman, especially when care has been your currency, desire doesn't respond well to ambiguity. It prefers clarity. But clarity requires edges, and edges require the willingness to disappoint. That's where the tension lives. Because disappointment feels like withdrawal. It feels like withholding love. It feels like doing something wrong. Yet, what I began to understand is that without disappointment, love has no shape. Without edges, it spills into everything and leaves nothing untouched. There is a myth that being deeply loved means being fully consumed, that the highest form of intimacy is complete access, that holding anything back is a form of distance. Midlife dismantles that myth quietly and without apology. I didn't want to be everything anymore. Not because I loved less, but because I finally understood the cost of being endlessly absorbable. I wanted my love to be chosen, not extracted, shared, not assumed. Desire that is never frustrated does not deepen it, overwhelms. It blurs the line between intimacy and entitlement. It confuses closeness with possession. And when that happens, something vital is lost. The separateness that makes love possible in the first place. Midlife returns that separateness to you, not gently, but honestly. It shows you that love cannot survive on generosity alone. It needs limits. It needs space. It needs the friction of two distinct lives meeting, not merging beyond recognition. This is not about pulling away. It's about pulling back enough to see yourself again. Desire will always ask for more. That is its nature. The question midlife forces is whether you will continue to answer every request automatically, or whether you will begin to ask what kind of love you are actually willing to sustain. Not love as sacrifice, not love as disappearance, but love with edges, love that leaves you whole. That understanding doesn't arrive dramatically. It settles slowly, often accompanied by guilt, confusion, and the unsettling sense that something once familiar now requires renegotiation. But beneath that discomfort is a quieter truth. Love that consumes everything, eventually consumes itself. Midlife doesn't ask you to stop loving. It asks you to stop being limitless. The quiet exhaustion of always being available. I didn't recognize my exhaustion right away because it didn't look like exhaustion. I wasn't collapsing. I wasn't failing. I wasn't falling behind. I was still showing up, still responding, still holding things together with a kind of quiet efficiency that had become second nature to me. That was the problem. The exhaustion I was carrying didn't come from doing too much. It came from never being unreachable. I had built a life where I was always available in small, invisible ways. Available to listen, available to adjust, available to absorb tension so others wouldn't have to, available to smooth over moments before they became uncomfortable, available to anticipate needs before they were spoken. None of this was dramatic. None of it looked like sacrifice from the outside. It looked like competence. It looked like emotional intelligence. It looked like love. And yet, over time, it began to hollow me out. The most dangerous thing about constant availability is that it feels virtuous. You don't notice it draining you because it earns approval. People trust you, rely on you, feel safe with you. You become the person others reach for without hesitation. But what no one sees is the cost of being perpetually open, of having no true off switch, of never fully belonging to yourself because some part of you is always tuned outward, listening for the next request, the next shift in tone, the next subtle signal that you are needed. Midlife made that cost visible. My body began to resist what my mind had normalized. I felt tired even after rest, irritable without a clear reason, less patient with things I once handled effortlessly. Not because I had changed for the worse, but because my internal resources were no longer infinite. I realized that availability had become an identity. I didn't just make time for others, I organized my inner life around being accessible. My attention was fragmented before I even noticed it was gone. My quiet moments were interrupted by a low-level vigilance that never fully shut off. I wasn't burned out from work. I was burned out from being emotionally on call. This kind of exhaustion doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't demand intervention. It seeps in gradually, disguised as responsibility, as kindness, as being low maintenance and easy to be around. And because it doesn't look like distress, it rarely receives care. What I began to understand in midlife is that constant availability is not the same as presence. Presence is intentional. Availability is reflexive. One is chosen, the other is assumed. I had trained myself to be available without asking whether I still wanted to be. There was a moment small, almost insignificant, when this became undeniable. I received a request that wasn't unreasonable, not urgent, not dramatic, and yet my immediate reaction was a wave of resentment so sharp it surprised me. That resentment wasn't about the request. It was about the accumulation. It was my nervous system saying quietly but firmly, there is nothing left to give here. Exhaustion is often framed as a time management problem. But what I was experiencing had nothing to do with schedules. It was a boundary problem, an identity problem, a lifetime of confusing responsiveness with worth. I had learned, slowly and subtly, that being needed was safer than being honest. That saying yes preserved connection while saying no introduced risk. That my availability was the price of belonging. Midlife disrupted that equation, not by making me selfish, but by making me finite. I could no longer ignore the fact that every moment of availability displaced something else. Every emotional accommodation required a quiet self-erasure. Every unexamined yes narrowed the space where my own thoughts, desires, and fatigue could exist without judgment. What made this particularly difficult was the absence of a clear villain. No one was exploiting me. No one was demanding too much outright. The expectations were mutual, implicit, reinforced over years of consistency, which meant the responsibility for change rested with me. That realization was heavy because withdrawing availability, even slightly, felt like betrayal. It felt like breaking an unspoken contract. It felt like risking disappointment in people who had come to rely on my steadiness. But midlife made something else equally clear. Continuing this way would require abandoning myself entirely. There is a quiet grief in recognizing how much of your life has been structured around being accessible. How many choices were guided by the question, will this inconvenience someone else? Rather than, is this sustainable for me? I didn't need a dramatic exit. I needed permission to pause, to be unreachable, to let silence exist without filling it. Exhaustion, I learned, is not always a sign that you need more rest. Sometimes it's a sign that you need fewer claims on your inner life. This kind of exhaustion asks for something radical in its simplicity. Restraint. The willingness to let others feel the absence you once rushed to prevent. The courage to allow space where you used to insert yourself automatically. Midlife doesn't demand that you stop caring. It asks that you stop disappearing in the act of care. The quiet exhaustion of always being available is not a personal flaw. It's a learned survival strategy that has outlived its usefulness. And once you see it clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend that availability is neutral. It is a choice, one with consequences. Midlife doesn't scold you for being generous. It simply asks a harder question. Who are you when you are no longer constantly accessible? That question doesn't come with an easy answer, but it does come with a kind of honesty that exhaustion alone can no longer carry. And perhaps that's the beginning of something quieter, but far more sustainable. The question no one asks at the middle of life. There is a question that waits patiently at the center of life. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't demand attention when you're busy surviving, building, proving. It understands that you needed distraction once. It knows you were carrying too much to look at it directly. So it waits. And then, somewhere in midlife, it steps forward not dramatically, not cruelly, but with a steadiness that makes avoidance impossible. The question is not, am I successful? It is not, did I make the right choices? And it is certainly not, how do I fix this? The question is far more unsettling. Who am I when I am no longer needed? I didn't want to ask it. I had structured my entire sense of self around usefulness, around being reliable, responsive, competent. I knew who I was in relation to others, what I provided, how I supported, where I fit. That identity had carried me far. It had earned me trust, stability, and a sense of belonging. But usefulness has a shadow. It teaches you to measure your worth by demand. It rewards you for staying relevant. It quietly convinces you that being wanted is the same as being known. Midlife is when that illusion begins to unravel. Not because people stop needing you, often the opposite, but because something inside you starts to resist the idea that need is the highest form of connection available. The part of you that has been deferred, postponed, and quietly managed begins to press forward, asking for recognition. I noticed it in moments that felt strangely empty despite being full. A full calendar, full conversations, full days. And yet, at the end of them, a sense that I had been everywhere except myself. That's when the question took shape. If I stopped being the one who filled the gaps, smoothed the edges, anticipated the needs, what would remain? Would there be anything left of me that wasn't organized around someone else's expectations? This is not a comfortable inquiry. It destabilizes identities built on contribution. It threatens the structures that have kept life functioning. It introduces uncertainty where competence once lived. And perhaps most frightening of all, it doesn't offer immediate answers. Midlife does not replace one identity with another. It creates a gap, a pause, a liminal space where the old definitions no longer hold, but the new ones have not yet formed. That gap can feel like failure if you've been trained to equate worth with productivity. It can feel like laziness or ingratitude or betrayal of the roles that once gave you meaning. But beneath those accusations is something quieter and truer, a longing to exist without justification. I realized that for years I had postponed myself, not out of neglect, but out of loyalty. Loyalty to responsibilities, to relationships, to versions of myself that were necessary at the time. But loyalty, when extended indefinitely, becomes erasure. Midlife reveals that cost. It forces you to confront the difference between being essential and being whole, between being valued for what you provide and being valued for who you are when nothing is required of you. This question, who am I without my usefulness, does not ask you to abandon your commitments. It asks you to stop mistaking them for identity. There is grief in this realization. Grief for the self that was never explored, for the desires that were labeled impractical, for the parts of you that learned to wait quietly while life moved forward without them. This grief is not dramatic. It doesn't demand resolution. It simply wants space to be acknowledged. Midlife is often described as a time of regret, but that's inaccurate. Regret implies a clear mistake. What surfaces here is something more complex: recognition. The recognition that a life can be well lived and still incomplete. That recognition doesn't mean you failed, it means you are paying attention. The question that emerges at the middle of life is not meant to be answered quickly. It is meant to reorient you, to shift the center of gravity from external validation to internal coherence. Who are you when you are not needed? What do you care about when no one is watching? What parts of yourself have you kept dormant because they didn't fit into the life you were sustaining? These questions don't come with instructions. They come with responsibility. Responsibility to listen without rushing to conclusions, to sit with uncertainty without immediately filling it with distraction, to allow yourself to exist in a state of not knowing without labeling it as weakness. Midlife doesn't ask you to reinvent yourself. It asks you to meet yourself perhaps for the first time outside of obligation. That meeting can feel awkward, unfamiliar, even disappointing, but it is also honest. And honesty, at this stage of life, is not a threat, it is a necessity. The question at the center of midlife is not there to dismantle your life. It is there to return you to it, not as a function, not as a role, not as a resource, but as a person unfinished, evolving, and finally allowed to exist without being immediately useful. That is not a crisis, it is a reckoning, and it is long overdue. Disappointment as a form of truth. The first time I disappointed someone on purpose, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened, my voice hesitated. I felt a familiar urge to explain myself, to soften the edges, to offer reasons that would make my refusal more palatable. I wanted to be understood immediately, forgiven instantly, absolved of the discomfort I was creating. But I didn't do it. I said no, and I stopped talking. What followed wasn't relief, it was exposure. Disappointment has a way of stripping things down to their essentials. It removes the cushioning we use to protect relationships from friction. It reveals what remains when approval is no longer guaranteed. For most of my life, I had treated disappointment as something to be avoided at all costs. It felt synonymous with harm, with rejection, with failure. I had learned slowly, quietly, that disappointing someone meant risking connection. And connection, to me, had always felt necessary for survival. So I became skilled at preempting disappointment. I anticipated needs before they were expressed. I offered myself early, often, and without resistance. I learned how to stay just ahead of other people's dissatisfaction, so I would never have to face it directly. What I didn't realize was that in avoiding disappointment, I was also avoiding truth. Truth creates friction. It has edges. It does not always arrive gently, and when it does, it often disrupts the version of harmony we've been carefully maintaining. Midlife brought me face to face with that disruption. I began to notice how much of my agreement had nothing to do with consent and everything to do with fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of no longer being the version of myself that others relied on. Disappointment, I discovered, is not inherently cruel, it's simply honest. It is the natural consequence of two people having different limits, desires, or capacities. The cruelty comes not from disappointing someone, but from erasing yourself to prevent it. When I finally allowed disappointment to exist without immediately rushing to repair it, something unexpected happened. The relationship didn't collapse. The world didn't end. What changed was the balance of power, not in an aggressive sense, but in a deeply revealing one. Disappointment exposed who was attached to me and who was attached to what I provided. That distinction is subtle, but it's everything. When you stop cushioning your boundaries, people are forced to relate to you as a person rather than a resource. Some will adapt, some will become uncomfortable, some will pull away not because you are wrong, but because the relationship was built on an unspoken agreement you no longer wish to uphold. This is where disappointment becomes a form of truth. It tells you which connections can survive honesty and which ones depend on your silence. It shows you who can tolerate your autonomy and who needs your compliance to feel secure. None of this is loud. None of it is dramatic. It often happens in small moments, a declined invitation, an unavailable evening, a refusal without apology. But those moments accumulate. They form a pattern. And that pattern reveals the architecture of your relationships in a way that generosity alone never could. For women especially, disappointment carries a particular weight. We are taught early that our value lies in our ability to maintain harmony, that being liked is safer than being clear. That saying no must always be justified, softened, explained. Midlife disrupts that conditioning not by making us indifferent, but by making us aware of the cost of perpetual accommodation. I realized that I had been treating disappointment as evidence of wrongdoing, when in reality it was evidence of differentiation, of separateness, of having a self distinct enough to resist being absorbed. That realization didn't make disappointment easier, but it made it meaningful. There is a kind of loneliness that comes with this shift. When you stop editing yourself for the comfort of others, the room gets quieter, fewer assumptions, fewer automatic affirmations, more space. That space can feel like loss at first. The loss of being effortlessly liked, the loss of being indispensable, the loss of knowing exactly where you stand because you've stopped standing where you always did. But in that space, something else becomes possible. Integrity. Integrity is not loud. It does not demand applause. It simply aligns your inner reality with your outer behavior. And disappointment is often the first sign that alignment is taking place. I learned that disappointing someone doesn't mean I stopped caring. It means I started telling the truth about what I could and could not give. It means I stopped offering access where there was no capacity. It means I began to respect my limits as much as I had respected other people's desires. This kind of honesty doesn't come without consequence. Some relationships change. Some dynamics shift. Some people test the new boundaries, hoping you'll return to what was familiar. And this is where disappointment does its deepest work. It teaches you to tolerate discomfort without abandoning yourself, to remain present without rescuing, to allow others to feel what they feel without taking responsibility for it. That is not indifference, it is maturity. Midlife doesn't ask you to harden. It asks you to clarify, to distinguish between connection and compliance, to understand that disappointment is not a failure of love, but a condition of it. Love without the capacity to disappoint is not intimacy, it's accommodation. And accommodation, when it replaces truth, eventually collapses under its own weight. Disappointment, when held with steadiness, becomes an invitation for relationships to evolve or to reveal their limits. I no longer see disappointment as something to avoid. I see it as a signal, a marker that I am no longer living exclusively in reaction to others, that I am allowing my inner life to have consequences. That shift is not easy. It doesn't come with reassurance, but it comes with something far more sustaining: self-respect. And self-respect, once it begins to take root, changes everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. Disappointment is not the opposite of love. It is the point where love stops lying. Why boundaries stop being optional in midlife? There was a time when boundaries felt negotiable, optional, something I could tighten or loosen depending on circumstances, moods, or other people's needs. Back then, flexibility felt like strength. Adaptability felt like maturity. I wore my openness like proof that I was easy to love, easy to work with, easy to keep. Midlife quietly corrected that belief, not with theory, with consequence. I began to notice that every place where I had no boundary was a place where something in me was slowly being depleted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently. My energy didn't disappear overnight. It thinned. My attention didn't collapse. It scattered. My sense of self didn't shatter. It blurred. What changed in midlife wasn't my values. It was my capacity. When I was younger, I could stretch without tearing. I could say yes reflexively and recover later. I could absorb tension, delay my own needs, overextend emotionally, and still feel like myself at the end of the day. That stopped being true. Midlife is when the body, the mind, and the nervous system form a quiet alliance. They begin to communicate limits you can no longer override with good intentions. Fatigue stops being something you can outwork. Irritation stops being something you can explain away. Resentment stops being something you can suppress without cost. Boundaries stop being theoretical at this point. They become physiological. I didn't decide to need boundaries. I discovered that I already needed them and had for a long time. What made this realization uncomfortable was how ordinary the violations were. No one was overtly disrespecting me. No one was crossing obvious lines. The erosion happened in subtleties. Assumptions of access, expectations of availability, emotional demands delivered without malice. And because these dynamics had developed slowly, setting boundaries felt abrupt, even aggressive. It felt like I was changing the rules of a game everyone else thought we were still playing fairly. That's one of the hardest truths of midlife. When you grow, it rarely feels convenient to the people who benefited from your previous limits. Boundaries stopped being optional because the cost of not having them became impossible to ignore. Every unprotected yes required a silent no somewhere else. no to rest, no to curiosity, no to parts of myself that needed space to exist without function. I realized that I had been confusing endurance with health. Just because I could tolerate something didn't mean I should. Just because I had adapted didn't mean the adaptation was benign. Midlife stripped away the fantasy that self-sacrifice could be neutral. Boundaries are often framed as walls, but that metaphor never felt accurate to me. Walls keep people out. What I needed wasn't distance, it was definition. Boundaries, I came to understand, are outlines. They clarify where I end and where others begin. They allow contact without collapse. Without boundaries, everything merges, needs blur, responsibility spreads thin, and slowly, imperceptibly, you lose track of what is yours to carry and what never was. In earlier years, I measured my worth by how much I could manage, how many emotional threads I could hold at once, how seamlessly I could integrate other people's needs into my own life. That skill was rewarded. It made me useful. It made me trusted. Midlife asked a different question. Is this sustainable? That question doesn't care how kind you are. It doesn't care how capable you've been. It doesn't care how much people rely on you. It only cares about truth. And the truth was simple and difficult. I could no longer afford to be boundaryless. What surprised me most was how internal boundaries mattered just as much as external ones. I wasn't only saying yes to others, I was saying yes to internal narratives that demanded constant justification. That told me rest had to be earned, that solitude needed a reason, that saying no required an explanation. Midlife challenged those assumptions. I began to see that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are acts of clarity. They say, this is what I can offer without losing myself. They say, this is where my responsibility ends. They say, this is the shape of my life now. And shapes matter. Without shape, everything spills. There is grief in this transition. Grief for the version of yourself who could give endlessly and still feel whole. Grief for the simplicity of being liked for your compliance. Grief for the ease of saying yes without consequence. But there is also relief. A quiet relief that comes from no longer negotiating with your own exhaustion, from no longer betraying your limits in the name of harmony. Boundaries in midlife are not about control. They are about conservation. They protect what is no longer renewable: attention, vitality, emotional bandwidth. They also reveal something essential about relationships. Some connections strengthen when boundaries appear. They adjust. They respect the new shape. Others strain, not because you are wrong, but because they depended on your lack of limits to function. This is painful, but it is instructive. Midlife doesn't allow you to outsource the consequences of your boundaries. It asks you to live with them, to tolerate the discomfort, to remain steady when others push back, to trust that clarity, even when it disappoints, is kinder than silent resentment. Boundaries stop being optional because the alternative is self-abandonment. And self-abandonment, by this point in life, is no longer survivable. I didn't become rigid. I became precise. I learned where I could bend and where I could not. I learned that flexibility without structure is just collapse delayed. Midlife taught me that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are what make love possible without erasing the person who is loving. They are not a declaration of independence from others. They are a declaration of responsibility to myself. And once that responsibility is felt, once it is embodied rather than understood, it cannot be undone. Boundaries stop being optional in midlife because your life finally becomes too real to live without them. When love is no longer about being needed, there was a time when being needed felt like love itself. Not the dramatic kind of love, not the kind that announced itself in grand gestures, but the quieter, steadier version, the kind that settles into routines and responsibilities. Being needed gave me a role, a place, a reason to stay. It told me that my presence mattered because something would fall apart without it. For a long time, that was enough. I didn't question it because need felt reciprocal. I was needed, and I needed to be needed. There was comfort in that symmetry. It gave love a clear shape. I show up, I provide, I stay useful, and in return, I belong. Midlife unsettled that equation. Not because people stopped needing me. If anything, the need increased. But something inside me shifted. A subtle resistance began to form, not against love itself, but against the version of love that required my constant usefulness as proof of worth. I started to notice how often love was expressed through reliance, through expectation, through the assumption that I would always be available, always responsive, always emotionally reachable in the same way I had been before. And for the first time, that assumption felt heavy. Being needed had once made me feel chosen. Now it made me feel trapped in a role I hadn't consciously agreed to keep playing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't rejecting anyone. I was simply aware that my presence was being counted on in ways that left little room for my own interior life. Midlife has a way of clarifying the difference between being valued and being depended on. Dependence feels like connection, but it often bypasses choice. It assumes continuity. It assumes that the conditions under which love was formed will remain unchanged even as the people inside it evolve. What I began to want slowly, quietly, was something different. I wanted to be chosen, not relied upon. Chosen with intention, not by default. Chosen because someone saw me as I was now, not because they needed the version of me that once made their life easier. That desire was unsettling, because it required letting go of a familiar kind of security. When you are needed, your place is clear. Your role is reinforced daily. When you are chosen, there is uncertainty. The choice must be renewed. It can be withdrawn. Midlife made me willing to tolerate that uncertainty. Not because I wanted less connection, but because I wanted a more honest one that didn't collapse if I stepped back, one that didn't depend on my constant presence to feel stable. This shift didn't happen all at once. It revealed itself in moments of quiet resistance, when I no longer rushed to fill silence, when I didn't immediately solve what someone else was struggling with, when I allowed myself to be present without performing reassurance. And in those moments, something unexpected emerged. Space. Space for the other person to meet me rather than lean on me. Space for desire to move in both directions. Space for love to exist without obligation as its primary language. I realized how much of my earlier version of love had been shaped by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being replaceable, fear that if I wasn't useful, I wouldn't be wanted. Midlife stripped that fear of its urgency, not because it disappeared, but because I could finally see it clearly. I could see how often I had confused indispensability with intimacy. Being needed can keep you close, but it doesn't always keep you known. When love is built primarily on need, it struggles to survive differentiation. It resists change. It becomes anxious when the other person grows, pulls back, or redefines themselves. It clings not out of malice, but out of insecurity. I didn't want to be clung to anymore, and I didn't want to cling. I wanted a love that could withstand space. A love that didn't interpret my autonomy as a threat. A love that could tolerate the fact that I was no longer organizing my life around being necessary. This wasn't about withdrawing affection. It was about withdrawing performance. I stopped overfunctioning emotionally. I stopped translating my needs into palatable language so they wouldn't disrupt anyone else. I stopped offering constant reassurance as proof of care, and in doing so, I discovered something quietly radical. Love doesn't disappear when you stop being needed. It changes shape. Some connections grew thinner. They had relied on my availability to maintain their closeness. When that availability shifted, the bond loosened not because there was no care, but because care alone was not enough to sustain it. Other connections deepened. They adjusted. They met me in the space I created rather than trying to close it. They allowed me to be complex, finite, and sometimes unavailable without interpreting it as rejection. Midlife taught me that being chosen is not louder than being needed. It's quieter, more deliberate, less guaranteed, but also more respectful. When love is no longer about being needed, it becomes about mutual presence rather than mutual dependence. It allows two whole people to stand beside each other instead of leaning until one of them collapses. This kind of love requires boundaries, disappointment, and the willingness to let others feel their own discomfort. It asks you to trust that your worth is not contingent on constant usefulness. That trust doesn't come easily. It grows slowly, often through loss, through relationships that don't survive the transition, through moments when you wonder if you've asked for too much simply by asking to exist more fully. But midlife does not lie to you about what you can sustain. It shows you that love rooted in need will always demand more as your capacity shrinks, and love rooted in choice will adapt as your shape changes. I no longer want to be loved because I am indispensable. I want to be loved because I am seen, even when I am not immediately helpful, even when I am quiet, even when I choose myself. When love is no longer about being needed, it becomes something less dramatic and far more honest. It becomes a meeting. And that, I've learned, is the kind of love that can last without asking you to disappear. Reframing the crisis. From panic to clarity. At some point, I realized that what I had been calling panic was not panic at all. It only felt like panic because I was trying to interpret it through the wrong lens. For a long time, I assumed that a midlife crisis was something to be managed, solved, pushed through as efficiently as possible. I treated the unease as a problem, something temporary, something irrational, something that would pass if I stayed busy enough or distracted myself long enough. But the feeling didn't pass. It softened at times, went quiet for stretches, then returned with a steadiness that felt intentional. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't urgent. It didn't ask me to make dramatic changes or burn my life down. It simply refused to be ignored. That's when I began to understand that this wasn't panic. It was clarity trying to surface through noise. Panic is frantic. It narrows your thinking. It demands immediate relief. What I was experiencing did the opposite. It slowed me down. It made me more observant. It pulled my attention inward, not to fix anything, but to notice. The discomfort of midlife is often misnamed because we don't have good language for clarity that disrupts comfort. We call it anxiety because anxiety is familiar. We call it crisis because crisis gives us permission to act dramatically. But what if the unease isn't asking for action at all? What if it's asking for orientation? Once I stopped trying to escape the feeling, something shifted. I began to listen instead of react. I stopped asking, how do I get rid of this? And started asking, what is this pointing toward? That question changed everything. Clarity does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as pattern recognition, as a growing awareness of what drains you, what numbs you, what quietly sustains you. It reveals itself through contrast, through noticing which moments leave you more yourself and which ones require you to disappear. Midlife doesn't hand you answers. It hands you data. And the data is subtle. I noticed how certain conversations left me inexplicably tired, while others made time feel slower in a good way. I noticed how some environments made me shrink, while others allowed me to breathe without effort. I noticed how often I agreed to things out of habit rather than desire. None of this felt revolutionary. It felt obvious once I stopped overriding it. Reframing the crisis meant relinquishing the fantasy of a single decisive turning point. There was no grand revelation, no moment of total clarity, just a gradual recalibration of attention. I began to understand that I didn't need to reinvent my life. I needed to stop living it on autopilot. The most profound changes were small and almost invisible. I allowed myself longer pauses before responding. I stopped filling every quiet moment with productivity. I spent time alone without trying to make it meaningful or efficient. These weren't solutions. They were experiments. Midlife clarity grows through experimentation, not certainty. Through trying something and noticing how it lands in your body, not how it looks on paper. Through paying attention to what feels congruent rather than impressive. The urgency I once felt began to dissolve, not because I had answers, but because I no longer needed them immediately. Panic thrives on the belief that time is running out. Clarity understands that rushing only recreates the same patterns under a different name. I also had to grieve the idea that clarity would feel empowering in the way we're taught to expect. There were no fireworks, no surge of confidence. Often, clarity felt quiet, even lonely. It stripped away narratives I had relied on. It removed excuses. It exposed choices I could no longer pretend I wasn't making. That kind of clarity is sobering. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't motivate you. It simply shows you where you are. And from there, it asks something very different than panic ever did. Panic says, do something, anything to make this stop. Clarity says, stay here long enough to understand. Midlife taught me that clarity requires patience. It unfolds slowly, often in ways that are incompatible with urgency. It asks you to tolerate ambiguity without rushing to resolution, to allow the old structures to loosen before new ones are built. This can feel like stagnation if you're used to movement as proof of progress. But it isn't stagnation. It's integration. The crisis reframed itself not as a breakdown, but as a reorientation, a shift in how I related to time, desire, boundaries, love, and myself. It wasn't pulling me away from my life, it was asking me to inhabit it differently. What I learned is that panic demands escape, while clarity demands presence. Presence with discomfort, presence with longing, presence with the reality that some answers only emerge after you've stopped forcing them. Midlife doesn't resolve things quickly because it isn't meant to. It's a season of discernment, not declaration, of noticing, not announcing, of learning how to listen to your own internal signals without translating them into socially acceptable narratives. Clarity, in this sense, is not the absence of doubt. It's the ability to move without betraying yourself. And that kind of clarity doesn't feel triumphant. It feels steady. It feels like no longer arguing with what your life is asking of you. When I stopped treating the midlife crisis as a threat, it stopped feeling like one. It became a conversation, one that required honesty, patience, and restraint. I didn't emerge with a plan. I emerged with alignment. And that, I've learned, is far more durable than certainty. The crisis didn't resolve itself because it was never meant to be resolved. It was meant to be understood. And once I allowed that understanding to take root, panic lost its voice. What remained was something quieter, slower, and infinitely more trustworthy. Clarity, not as an answer, but as a way of seeing. There is a quiet relief that comes when I finally stop asking what's wrong with me. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because I recognize the pattern I've been trying to escape. For so long, I treated this season of my life as a malfunction, a delay, a personal failure to arrive where I was supposed to be. I kept searching for the flaw that would explain why I felt suspended, functional but unsettled, capable but unanchored. What I see now is simpler and harder to accept. I'm not broken. I'm in the middle. The middle is not a place we prepare for. There are no rituals for it, no clear language. We are taught how to begin, and we are taught how to end. But the middle is treated like an inconvenience, something to endure quietly while waiting for clarity to return. But the middle is where most of life actually happens. It's where certainty dissolves, where identities loosen, where the old rules stop working, but the new ones haven't been written yet. And because we live in a culture that equates clarity with competence, being in the middle can feel like failure, even when it's the most honest place we've ever been. I spent years trying to outrun this feeling. I thought if I made the right decision, committed to the right version of myself, optimized my time and my choices, the discomfort would disappear. That's what we're taught to believe, that unease is a signal to fix something quickly. But the middle doesn't respond to force. It responds to presence. The truth is, the middle is not a mistake. It's a passage, a threshold between who I had to be and who I'm becoming. And thresholds are not meant to be rushed through. They require waiting, listening, and the willingness to stand in uncertainty without demanding immediate resolution. This is where so many of us turn against ourselves. We label our questioning as weakness, our fatigue as laziness, our desire for space as ingratitude. We assume that if we were stronger, more disciplined, more grateful, we wouldn't feel this way. But strength isn't the absence of doubt. It's the ability to stay with it. Midlife doesn't break you. It removes distractions. It strips away the urgency that once kept you moving without asking why. It exposes the parts of your life that no longer fit, not to shame you, but to invite honesty. And honesty is destabilizing. It asks you to see yourself without the scaffolding of constant achievement or approval. It asks you to tolerate being undefined for a while, to resist the temptation to prematurely settle on a new identity just to relieve the discomfort of not knowing. Being in the middle feels lonely because it's not performative. There's nothing to show for it, no visible transformation, no clear narrative arc others can follow. From the outside, it may look like stagnation. From the inside, it's anything but. It's an internal reorganization. I've learned that the middle is where grief and possibility coexist, where I mourn the versions of myself that no longer make sense, even as I feel the faint outline of something new taking shape. That coexistence is uncomfortable because it resists simplification. You can't reduce it to optimism or despair. You have to hold both. The middle also teaches humility. It shows you the limits of control. It reminds you that not everything unfolds on your timeline, no matter how intentional you try to be. Some clarity only emerges after prolonged uncertainty. Some answers only arrive after you stop demanding them. This goes against everything we're taught about productivity and progress. We're encouraged to move quickly, decide decisively, and avoid ambiguity. But the middle asks for the opposite. It asks you to slow down, to observe, to notice what your life is revealing rather than what you think it should become. I've come to understand that being in the middle is not about fixing myself. It's about staying present long enough to be changed by what I'm seeing. There is a quiet courage in that. Courage doesn't always look like bold action. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like not rushing into the next chapter just to escape the discomfort of the current one, like allowing yourself to be unfinished without apologizing for it. The middle is not a void, it's a container, a space where old patterns loosen their grip and new values begin to form, where you learn what you can no longer tolerate and what you are no longer willing to sacrifice. And perhaps most importantly, the middle teaches you how to belong to yourself again, not as a role, not as a function, but as a living, changing person. I no longer believe that clarity is something you achieve and then keep forever. I see it now as something that ebbs and flows, deepens and recedes. The middle doesn't promise permanent answers. It offers something more sustainable. Alignment. Alignment with what feels true now. Alignment with what your body and your attention are asking for. Alignment with the life that is actually unfolding, not the one you imagined you'd have by this point. There is nothing wrong with being here. The middle is not evidence of failure. It's evidence that you've lived long enough to question what no longer fits, that you've paid attention long enough to notice the gap between expectation and experience, that you care enough about your life to stop running from yourself. If you feel suspended, uncertain, quietly undone, this is not a sign that you've lost your way. It's a sign that you're standing in it. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not failing to become who you're meant to be. You are simply in the middle, where meaning is redefined, where truth is negotiated gently, and where the next version of you is forming without needing to announce itself yet. And that is not a problem to solve. It is a place to stand. You're not broken. You're just in the middle,